Welcome to our final event for the academic year 2024-2025. We're very grateful to First United Methodist for hosting this event and the support of the Henry Luce Foundation for allowing us to build the Center for the Study of Evangelicalism and support this speaker series that has allowed us to explore not only cultures of evangelicalism, but the changing dynamics of religion in a rapidly shifting world. I'd also like to thank Director of the Center, Professor Jeffrey Scholes, Professor of Philosophy at UCCS, and Associate Director, Dr. Paul Harvey, Distinguished Professor of History, for their leadership in bringing this programming out into the community. We also could not have had these events without generous support from community members like you. And one anonymous donor has pledged $50,000 in matching funds over the next 3 years to support our ongoing programming. And I invite you to help realize our dreams of centering the Center for the Study of Evangelicalism as a key institution in Colorado and the nation committed to learning, dialogue, and discovery at the intersections of religion, politics, and culture. If you're interested in providing a donation or for signing up for a newsletter, please find Kurt either during or after the event, and he'd be happy to take your information. With that, I'd like to introduce our speaker for this evening. Professor Hulsether is a theorist of religion, culture, and politics in the Americas and an assistant professor of religious studies at Skidmore College. During the 2024-2025 academic year, she served at Brown University as a senior fellow in race and ethnicity and lecturer in religious studies. Her core areas of study and teaching include capitalism and labor, histories of social movements, feminist theory, popular culture and media, and other topics in contemporary cultural critique. Her first book, Capitalist Humanitarianism, was published in 2023 with Duke University Press. It won the 2024 Best First Book Prize from the Cultural Studies Association. She's currently working on 2 projects, one on the gendered history of youth civic engagement programs and another on the cultures of competitive college debate. Her research has appeared in journals like Public Culture, the Journal of the American Academy of Religion, Differences, a Journal of Feminist Cultural Studies, and the Journal of Religion and American Culture. She has also written popular pieces for outlets like Jacobin, Religion and Politics, and Imminent Frame. She, with her mentor, Tina Pippin, also co-host Nothing Never Happens, a radical pedagogy podcast. She received her PhD in religious studies from Yale University in 2020, and she holds a Master's of Divinity from Harvard and a BA from Agnes Scott College. Please join me in welcoming Professor Lucia Hulsether.
Thank you so much, George, for that. It's really a pleasure to be here with all of you today. I have many people to thank. First, just thanks to the Center for the Study of Evangelicalism for bringing me to campus and for just the fun and hospitality of the last couple of days. Paul Harvey, Jeffrey Scholes, George Bayuga, you are all models of generous scholarship, and it's an honor to be in your company. Ben Slytholm did so many tasks that went way beyond simple logistics and helps me think about this talk, and he really is the MVP of this evening, even though he's not here. And thanks to everybody who's here. I know that there are lots of demands on your time and your energy, and so it means a lot to me that you're here to think with me about this book, Capitalist Humanitarianism. So today, I want to talk about some of the central ideas and concerns that drove my book, which maps the cultural politics of its title, Capitalist Humanitarianism, a concept that I will get to more and more later. But for now, I'll say that there are a couple of layers to how I'm defining the term. In the most concrete sense, I'm referring to a range of 20th and 21st century attempts to create a relatively more socially responsible, ethical, and humanitarian system of monetized surplus value, property, expropriation, and wage labor. So we could probably spend the rest of our evening listing examples of projects to pursue the proverbial double bottom line, from fair trade companies to microfinance banks to corporate social responsibility offices, to buy one, give one sales models like Tom's Shoes, to so-called ESG investing, to accelerator programs for social entrepreneurs. All of these models have their own historical, institutional, and practical contingencies. Capitalist humanitarianism is a word for the logic that they share in common and that draws them together. It names hope or even an expectation that free market capitalism can be a context for enacting feminist, anti-racist, and anti-colonial solidarities with people who are targeted by the racist, gendered, economic violence that free markets so often inflict. I contend in this book, and I would still contend today, that some version of capitalist humanitarianism is part of the background noise of contemporary life, not an anomaly. At the outset of this project, from my vantage point as a scholar and also an organizer in various economic, justice, and immigrant rights campaigns, I wanted to know, how was it that elite corporate and financial entities began to reappropriate and absorb the vocabularies of left social justice movements? I was especially interested in the absorption of vocabularies of left political movements that have historically been so deeply invested in other kinds of economic strategies anchored in refusal, like boycotts, divestments, and strikes. How was it that some of these folks who were committed to radical programs of redistribution and refusal began to imagine that they, or we, could pursue some relative form of social democracy and social justice through conspicuous consumption, labor commodification, and debt capital? And what would it be to write against the fragile compromise and consensus that some of these capitalist humanitarian projects represent? How could we break its sense of inevitability and smoothness? It wasn't just that capitalist humanitarian projects put a happier face on systems of exploitation. The effect of capitalist humanitarian projects, I argue, is to manage and assimilate the contradictions and tensions that come from being a conscious witness to and beneficiary of this current order of things under empire. What I am most interested in is how a certain set of values, fantasies, and attachments get woven into the rhythms of everyday life until they shape our imaginations so much that we struggle to notice them or break from them. Okay, we can talk about all of this, but first I imagine that some of you might be wondering, what does this project have to do with religion? And what does it have to do with evangelicalism? When I am asked this question, I usually give one of two answers. Here's the first. This book aims to shift how we, readers, scholars, people in the world, understand the relationship between Christianity and capitalism in the Americas. Now, there are many books, more and more, in fact, on the relationship between religion and capitalism in North America and globally. There are some of my favorites on that board. They have tended to focus on the relationship between Christianity and the political and economic right. We know a lot about the evangelical right-wing Christians behind Walmart, behind Hobby Lobby. We know a lot about Christian business tycoons in the Cold War, Pentecostal missionaries installing prosperity gospel abroad. What I have noticed in these histories is that we know a lot less about how liberal and left Christians have participated in rising capitalist hegemony. Don't get me wrong, these people do show up quite a lot, but usually it's in the context of their civil rights work, union organizing, and liberation theologies. But when I was in the archives of capitalist humanitarian organizations, I found that I was plopped squarely into the history of church people who from the outside look like the total opposite of Walmart evangelicals. Nevertheless, these liberal and left Christians played a major role in laying the groundwork for conscious consumer campaigns and development finance projects that have proliferated in recent decades. I will give you two examples. Anyone know about the fair trade chain 10,000 Villages? Ever heard of it? Yeah, I see some nods. This is 10,000 Villages. It is it's a fair trade market. If you walk into a store, you kind of get all the familiar smells of a fair trade market, like it smells, senses, the colors, the pictures of the producers who made the product that are on the scarves, the coffee, the chocolate. Does anyone know who founded 10,000 Villages? The Mennonites. The Mennonite Central Committee founded 10,000 Villages in the 1940s, and the woman who drove that founding was named Edna Ruth Byler. She was the spouse of an overseas church worker, and she was witnessing the suffering of people who were displaced in US-occupied Puerto Rico and also in occupied Palestine. And she decided to help them and raise awareness about their situations by employing them to create textile art and sell their products back to people in their churches in Pennsylvania. There's a very, very public narrative about 10,000 Villages that you can find on their website and in their public materials, where they'll say, they'll have Edna Ruth Byler saying, I'm just a woman, I'm helping other women, women like domestic things, like here are people making nice pillowcases and things for the home, and we can connect over this. So this is kind of economic solidarity. What is less known about 10,000 Villages is that the main consumers that got the initial project off the ground when it was still known as the Needlework Project and later self-help crafts in the 1970s, those consumers were US tourists to Israel and the IDF that were very interested in buying Palestinian crafts made by people in the refugee camps who were living there because they had been driven from their homes. And so we see really early on how this narration of a history of social justice capitalism, of fair trade as a kind of global economic solidarity, is both trying to provide relief from the conditions of war and colonialism at the same time as it is growing up entirely dependent on it for its economic sustainability. I am really interested in how these projects like 10,000 Villages, narrate their own histories, how they tie their rise to ideas of solidarity, and even in this case to the biblical Holy Land as a sort of like memory of their beginnings. My second example is about the historical roots of what later becomes known as microfinance. Some of the roots of, so microfinance is the practice, it's an economic practice that emerges especially in the 1970s and 80s and then grows up more in the 1990s and 2000s. Some of you might have heard of Muhammad Yunus, who founds Grameen Bank and wins a Nobel Peace Prize. Microfinance is a practice of offering credit, so debt-based loans to poor people, who often women in the global south who would not otherwise have access to capital investments. And the idea is that through these small loans, they can grow their businesses and become more integrated into global markets. What is less known about microfinance is that all this language of sort of empowerment of women of color, the debt loads on this microfinance, the APR often runs about 40%, which is justified as less than what loan sharks in local areas are charging. The first major microfinance bank, one of them, there are three that I talk about, but one is named Finca, was backed by early liberation theology reading and anti-capitalist Christians who had been politicized in the Central America Solidarity movement. These supporters believed that microcredit could help small-scale indigenous farmers stand up against financial austerity and free trade policies ripping through the region after decades of dictatorship and civil war. Okay. Those are very quick examples. Happy to talk more in the Q&A. There is a lot that we could say about this. There is the gendering of these programs as by and for women, and also very concerned about the nuclear family and sort of family businesses. There's the question of what some of my business school interlocutors might call mission drift. How was it that these folks, all of whom had explicit critiques of capitalism and who were aiming for models of living based on socialist democracy and mutual aid, how did they end up with this kind of mainstream identity? We could debate here how Christian theological frames are present in this work and how they might have been transformed in that work, and I'm happy to talk about all of this. But right now, what I would suggest is that these actors' affiliation with missionary organizations and churches is not really the most interesting thing about them, to me. More compelling to me is how you can see these like well-intentioned folks fumbling towards a set of vocabularies and motifs and images that create the coordinates of a later explosion of capitalist humanitarian consciousness and reform. Throughout my research, I have noticed a pattern in how capitalist humanitarians, by which I mean not only fair traders and makers, but also people like me, people who are interested in being a little more ethical or less unethical under the constraints of capitalism. I have noticed a pattern in how we come to our reform projects and attempts to do better. There is a litany, and it is anchored in a historical recognition. I realize the system that I'm participating in is rooted in histories of racist, sexist, and colonial violence. There's a fair trade cartoon that says, "There's blood in my coffee." Connected to this realization of the histories that have brought us here and made us complicit is a confession of that personal complicity. The things that make possible my good life right now are premised on the suffering of someone who is far worse off than me, and we know that. And then there's this moment of commitment to doing something different. What if my commodity attachments could express solidarity instead of violence? What if the workplace could promote networks of care and friendship? What if a corporation, a university, a church built on slavery and colonialism could rededicate some of its profits to helping oppressed people? I kept seeing that kind of narrative arc repeated over and over again, this cycle of exposure of violence, opening up into a critique of the self, but then opening up into these projects that to me were reproducing some of the structural conditions that created the problems in the first place. And while I was writing, I was trying to think about how can I critique this narrative without reproducing it in how I talk about it. So as I wrestled with this question, I started playing with the narrative of my book a little bit to try to come into a description in a slightly different way. So this is a little bit untraditional in a talk, but I'm going to read to you sometimes. I'm going to go back and forth between talking to you about my book and reading to you from it. And what I'm going to read now is a description of an event at Harvard Divinity School in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which did a panel on spiritual entrepreneurship and how people can reimagine entrepreneurship as ministry. One of the things that I think capitalist humanitarians are doing is re-theorizing the terms of capitalism, and in this case, they were re-theorizing the commodity fetish. Okay. This is the picture that I'm going to describe in a moment. All right, are you ready? You're allowed to laugh. I hope you will laugh. I'm trying to be funny. Okay. My suspicion that my graduate education had made me a more bitter mimic of the entrepreneurs I was studying crested in March 2019, when a fellow alumna of Harvard Divinity School told me about an event that our alma mater had been boosting on social media. The business of spirituality, on money, branding, and other taboos, would feature spiritual and wellness entrepreneurs, quote, advising theological studies students on how to market their ministerial gifts. The event happened in the Amber Lecture Hall, where for generations the most storied voices in religious and theological studies have held court over their student acolytes, who look down on the speaker platform from stadium seats. I had tuned in remotely from my New Haven studio apartment. I settled at the pinewood board that balanced between two salvaged file cabinets constituted my writing desk. A monitor flooded my apartment with machine-generated light, which showed 5 women perched on Harvard-branded chairs with side tables where a production assistant had propped their glossy business self-help books. My eyes landed on a white woman who wore saffron robes and a head wrap for her dreadlock updo. She chatted with a blonde in a black power suit. A third speaker wore a black top hat. I was mid-wonder whether there had been a costume party memo when a person dressed in leather leggings and a solid glitter gold shirt called the virtual room to order. Tonight, she announced, our 4 guests would help us feel, quote, more comfortable, or at least less tortured, about making good money for our spiritual work. The introductions cued, I wandered 8 paces to my galley kitchen for a LaCroix, listening to their bios as I went. First up was Kate Northrup, a mother and social entrepreneur of undefined industry, who wrote the best-selling financial advice book, Money, a Love Story. Second was Raw Goddess, a former US envoy to Rwanda turned, quote, entrepreneurial soul coach behind hundreds of breakthrough change makers. I was unsure what this meant, but we had already moved on to the third speaker, the one in robes. She was Guru Jagat, a Kundalini yoga master, quote, defining the new feminine matriarchal archetype now that Piscean and patriarchal energies are fading into history. The fourth panelist, Miki Agrawal, followed. She had just published an advice book based on her experience as a co-founding CEO of the menstrual blood absorbing panties company Thinx, and now was at the bidet company called Tushy. I recognized her as the executive from a New York Times expose on labor conditions at the underwear company. Workers had alleged that their self-identified she-EO boss had, among other behaviors, passed off as feminist leadership, gone nude in the open plan office, and held mandatory remote meetings from her toilet. The board fired her. She moved to Tushy after that. Tonight's organizers had other taboo topics in mind. The student facilitator didn't pull punches. How do you know how much to charge for your services and how much it is appropriate to charge? Northrup responded by discussing how she discerned fees for her feng shui consulting business. I would go to a session charging a certain amount, and then I would walk away with a check in my hand and feel, did that feel equal to the energy I just expended? If it didn't, then I charged more to the next person, which may seem a little bizarre, but that is what I did. I just really checked in with the feeling of walking away. Or I would imagine the feeling of walking away from a consult and feel like, okay, whatever I was charging, I don't remember what I was charging. But how did that feel in my purse walking away, essentially? Because money, we made it up. It doesn't exist. It's just, what is it? It's nothing. We all just agreed that it exists. Okay, recap. Money is a socially constructed way of balancing the energetic expenditure of Northrup's labor. I was coughing on her use of the first person plural. Who agreed that money existed? When Agrawal lurched in Northrup's direction. I actually literally talk about this exact thing in my book, Disrupt Her, she exclaimed, her gesticulations blurred by the spat-out seltzer dripping down my monitor. Money is a made-up energy exchange that we all agreed to. But, she paused, when you take that further, everything is a made-up construct. When you take that further, everything is a made-up construct. Literally, like the fact that there are these weird borders on this planet where weird people in uniforms, in costumes, are wearing uniforms that we made up, and you have to get past them with little pieces of paper called passports that we made up. And we're like, yeah, we're gonna do that on this made up thing, but with like imaginary lines. And then the same thing with time. The same thing with, literally careers, professional failure. Somewhere I had stood up and begun to pace the 3-meter distance between my unmade bed and the desk. To Agrawal's ramble, I could log extra steps on my smartwatch. She was explaining that because geopolitical arrangements are made up, we can literally invent any new possibility we want if we give ourselves permission. Case in point, her recent venture. When she gave herself permission to innovate, an idea seized her. Why am I wiping my ass with dry paper? This is fucking weird. Enter Tushy. For each bidet sold, Tushy will donate to a startup that builds pay-to-use toilets in India's slums and thereby solves the, quote, defecation problem. I stared open-jawed, frozen a few steps back from my keyboard. It wasn't like I couldn't have predicted the social responsibility turn, but there was something about how she ended up there, how she reasoned her way to this particular innovation. Now I figure that what stopped me in my tracks, even evoked my awe, was how these women had managed a language of deconstruction light. They used terms and methods of social theory to situate the substance of their success, including the capital made available to them, the high returns they'd gleaned, the employees they'd supervise. They framed it all with deconstruction, with a kind of warped feminist theory in terms of a reciprocal energy exchange with the universe. At times, they sounded like they had read Marx's The Power of Money in a Bourgeois Society and came away galvanized to spread that gospel. Yes, precisely. Isn't capital grand? Okay. I wonder, as I think about this, what we are doing when we critique the world and when we analyze the world. These are bigger questions than I could ever answer in one talk or one life. But thinking with those theorists, I think, of religion and capitalism, as much as I disagree with them, this gets me to the second way that I could map this project onto the academic study of religion. I could tell you that capitalism is religion, because the itineraries of financial capitalism and commodity culture are the main structures that have organized our collective life. They're a structure with totems and rituals, all of which add up to a larger social function. There are a lot of scholars who take a version of this approach, both from a more analytic religious studies perspective, and also from a more explicitly theological studies angle, like Christian theologians who argue that neoliberal capitalism is an idolatrous church, distracting people from worshiping God. In fact, this latter line of argument in No Rising Tide by George Rieger influenced a billionaire investor I met who said that he wanted to throw off the Church of Neoliberalism and build with his hedge fund a reformed Church of the New Capital that would align profit with purpose. If I wanted to say that capitalism was a religion, the Business of Spirituality panel at Harvard would seem to be a very good proof. It's framing entrepreneurship through the language of Christian ministry. I could say that the system of symbols, meanings, and social organization giving us the bidet company or whatever is the new religion, and a bad one at that, and that we should organize another one. But I think that this is a mistake because it risks overemphasizing the coherence of capitalist worlds. I think that when we describe capitalism or any other system of power, it's really important to try to lay bare the conflicts and the tensions and the crises that are already imminent to it. Rather than generalizing about how smooth a capitalist project is, I think we should be anchored in the knowledge that any incorporative project, which is also the project of empire, is ongoing and thus incomplete. If this is true, then part of the work of writing about capitalist humanitarianism is about bringing out the conflicts latent within it and to try to enact them and bring them further into crisis. So now I want to read another passage of my book to you where some of these considerations became especially intense and problematic for me. I'm going to set the stage. In summer 2016, I was doing ethnographic field work with microfinance institutions that were operating between the United States and Guatemala. There was a microfinance institution that had actually grown directly out of a Christian solidarity organization that had organized what it called a, quote, social action adventure tour of social entrepreneurship in Guatemala. The trip was designed to recruit and retain investors and donors. And we were on this trip with a group of gringos from the US around day 4, and the structure had been that we were working with, that there was a US bank that was funding local Guatemalan banks that were in turn funding local Guatemalan businesses and entrepreneurs. We were riding around in the van with the executive director of the US microfinance institution and the local bank agents going to the homes of clients. The final stop on the day's social action adventure tour was a footwear factory. Our banker guides regaled us with its backstory on an hour-long journey through elevated and bumpy terrain. The owner of the enterprise launched it as a solo startup with a $150 loan, and less than 4 years later had grown it into a shoe manufacturing business with 40 employees. Unlike other micro-enterprises which were run out of their founders' homes, this one had acquired commercial property near the center of town. One side of the street ran along a mountain's razor edge, which plunged downward to farm plots below. On the other side, children milled outside of a primary school, and sleepy bodegas advertised discounted sodas. We pulled to the side, unloaded, and approached the door of the unmarked 2-story building, and filed into a dim downstairs cluttered with furniture and tables. A staircase, which was more like a glorified ladder jutting out from a hole in the ceiling, descended into the middle of the room. Beneath those stairs, a woman hunched over a Bunsen burner. We passed her on our way to the steps, which led to a brighter room where about 20 people worked on a haphazard assembly line. Fabrics, shoe molds, and various cutting and measuring tools had spilled out from crisscrossed tables onto a floor so cluttered with detritus that only about half of it was visible. I calibrated every single step to avoid tripping, especially near a table with more open flames. Torn out pages from an old swimsuit magazine issue decorated a segment of the wall. Stressed? Asked a newspaper caption glued near one of the beach photos. Masturbate, it will relax you. Less than a minute in, my surroundings were blurry. Were the glue fumes affecting my balance? Why weren't there windows in here? I began a countdown for how long I could hold my breath, and only then did I register the youth of the workers themselves. They can go to school in the morning and then come to work to earn money, the founder explained over the noise. Their families needed the income, so they came here to paste together shoe parts, melt down globs of plastic, sew canvas, and thread laces through tiny holes. They also showed up to talk and laugh with their friends. The sounds of their chatter clanged off the concrete walls. 2 older men circled the room in apparent supervision of the production process, directing the children back to their tasks with a spoken reprimand or a physical touch on the shoulder. Our group fanned out to the extent that we could. The board member snapped photos. At no point did our group actually talk to the workers, except in instances where certain tourists half asked a person's permission for a photo and half announced their intention to take one. The workers would nod or sometimes giggle or make eye contact and then return to whatever they had been doing. I loitered by the exit and inhaled through my t-shirt. If I was heaving for breath, how were these workers faring, and how were they working? And how would I even begin to describe this scene without sensationalizing it? Our leaders had prepared us to encounter a prize micro-enterprise developed by a guy who had started fixing shoes as a side hustle out of his house and then grown himself into the biggest employer in town. And they had brought us to a sweatshop. Back in the van, my tour mates buzzed. "He's employing the youth of the community," the board member said, scrolling through her trove of digital photos while her daughter peeked at them over her shoulder. "What a great opportunity for them," added another longtime donor. I swallowed, tried not to unleash a tirade, and interjected with all the diplomacy I could muster. They looked pretty young. Did anyone have concerns about the air quality? When my seatmate replied that it was messy and stuffy but seemed fine otherwise, I showed her the photo I'd taken of the masturbation caption. At the time, I was confident that it would prove something about bad working conditions. My neighbor, the adult daughter of the donor, raised her eyebrows and said the display was weird. But the director interrupted before any discussion could get traction. She told us that the factory was the best option these kids had, not least because they were building skills and a record of work that would help them land more lucrative jobs in the future. It was like parallel universes. I saw sweatshop labor. She saw empowerment. So I think another version of this book would have left the shoe factory and looked for moments of resistance and worker uprising against it, and certainly all of that exists. I could have lifted up grassroots organizers and popular movements that have pushed back, but I did not do that. And that was for two reasons. I think people have written about that, but the second reason was that I didn't think it was my role. It seemed like it would be outing the people who were trying their best in these places to undermine some of the most intense expropriation. There's an anthropologist named Julia Elliott-Char who talks about overseas NGO development as partly about identifying the mutual aid and survival networks of poor people and then absorbing them into financial systems for a kind of global elite profit, often over and against the wishes of the people involved. The question as I was doing this ethnography was not so much to convey where the saboteurs were, and to not even suppose that as a white person from the global north, this was even mine to know, but instead to convey that not all of us in that space were seeing the same thing. There was difference there. We did not agree. And so to imagine this as only a place where empowerment was happening and erase the dissent, or only a place where there was a sweatshop and erase that there was another narrative becoming born that perhaps we need to interrupt, that we needed to find ways to articulate that differently. Struggle is ongoing and it is contextual, and we need to tune our ears to those places without snitching on people. The places of struggle are constantly changing. So I'll say, as I begin to move towards a space of question and answer, that I wrote this book in a space of contradictions, where the stakes of the labor regimes, global and local, that I am describing became real in a way that I could not have predicted when I started out. So some of you know that when you're writing a dissertation, this book began as a dissertation, you often do a bunch of your research, your archive, or you go off, you do your archival research, your ethnography, and then you come back and you sit down and write. In that bridge summer between when I had done most of the research and begun to write, two things happened, two disruptions, both related to the blows of capitalism in the most intimate part of life, changed the stakes of what I was doing, or amplified them and made them visible. The first was that the graduate workers of Yale University were in an enormous fight to have our union recognized by our employer before the first Trump administration could rescind the rights of university graduate students to unionize at all. In a last-ditch effort to bring the university to the bargaining table, we began a hunger strike. I joined the hunger strike, and at the same time as I was on the hunger strike, my dear younger brother, Mark, was working as a representative at a call center in Milwaukee. He was making his way, he was trying to get through life as a working class person and a part-time musician, and he had begun to experience psychosis related to the abusive dynamics of his workplace. And things had gotten quite intense. They had gone downhill. And it was on my fourth day of hunger striking that Mark died by suicide, too manic and too desperate and without health care to go on another day. My research for this book had begun somewhere else. My writing began there. I knew it because I had been involved in organizing, but you know it in a differently and an embodied way in loss. That capitalist humanitarianism isn't something that goes on somewhere else with those people over there doing misguided mission work. Capitalist humanitarianism is in our bodies and in our minds. It's a good cop in our head, urging us to normalize crisis and manage unbounded grief with kinds of political compromise and reinvestment in the conditions that, even if they're a little less worse than the worst kinds of capitalism, probably brought us here in the first place. Another word for capitalist humanitarianism is a violent, deranged, not in a good way, response to losses that cannot be repaired. One thing about this book, I've read to you the parts from the main chapters that are mostly ethnographic and historical, But between those, there is some situating of those passages within the experience of grieving and organizing through losses, and imagining how is it that in a moment of intense rage at the abuses of capitalism that lead to premature death, we are brought back in to be invested subjects. And so I thought a lot about grief when I was writing this book. I thought a lot about grief for genocide. I thought about what would happen if some Christian missionaries, well-intentioned, went to Gaza right now and said, hey, here's some textile, here's some thread, here's some fabric that you can sew together, and we'll sell it to our church folks back home, or we'll sell it to the IDF, and maybe you can have some money to rebuild your life. It would be well-intentioned and maybe so misguided that we could not even begin to articulate how much and how painful that interaction would be. And that's a macro kind of imaginative exercise that I've been thinking about a lot over the past year and a half. But those imaginative exercises came to me maybe a little bit without consent as I was grieving the death of my brother. So I'm going to read to you another passage, this time from an interlude that is paired with chapter 6 about the politics of grief. And even though this is grim, you're allowed to laugh a little bit. I know I'm not supposed to judge the grieving for their processes. Everyone has their own experience of loss. That's what the loveliest of humans, the ones who baked us casseroles and who remember the anniversary of Mark's death year after year, always say. But I do fault people for how they grieve, and I think you should too. If not for the feelings that they're feeling, then how the causes and consequences of those feelings tend to get a political pass, how they insulate lived experience from critique and underwrite dubious recovery projects, whether or not we are conscious of it. I inherit my standards from my mother, and this is a compliment to her. After Mark died, she announced a race for what we called the Consolation Prize. It involved ranking the most gratuitously bad attempts at comfort. The third place prize, awarded in part on the basis of its repetition, went to the colleague who on a near daily basis harangued her. You can't walk around sad forever. You have to reclaim your joy. The second place prize was clinched by the man who approached my mother at a meeting of Presbyterian clergy, rested his hands on her shoulders and said, Mark lived exactly the right amount of days. Not a day longer or shorter than he should have. He was 26. He died at precisely the right time. I want you to believe that. The grand prize went to the person who, after he overheard my mom say something about her boy being at peace now, felt moved to inform her that she, a minister, should know better. It was possible, after all, that Jesus had remanded her child to hell. Whatever the Lord's judgment, we trust in its righteousness, he boomed, patting her back. The Lord is always righteous. The Lord's judgment has nothing on mine. I am making an inventory of all of the worst ways to grieve. Where do you even start? There was Achilles, who responded to the death of his boyfriend by slaughtering thousands of people on the battlefield, then revenge murdering the perpetrator and dragging that guy's corpse around Troy on the back of a chariot. There was God, whose grief at the scale of sin prompted him to commit genocide on the planet except for Noah and some cherry-picked companions. Then there are the less mythical examples. I'd nominate anyone who ever cited the death of John McCain or Ronald Reagan or any other war criminal statesman to silence popular dissent or valorize civility. I dedicate a whole category to the generational traumas used to justify military occupation, apartheid, and racist state building. I'd file it next to the bracket that tracks mass commodification of loss, breast cancer ribbons, and the tyrannical optimism they inflict on the sick. Designer t-shirts emblazoned with the latest victim of police murder, rainforest certified products by companies that dump wildlife murdering carbon into the air. Any grief memoir that effaces its political context. Any grief memoir that is the preface to an advice manual for corporate executives. Any grief memoir that ends in a nationalist credo. Any grief memoir that derives closure from new babies. Any and all grief that imposes normativity on the most endangered of the dead, the queer, the mad, the disconsolate, the extreme, the uncompromising, the lost. I'm speaking tonight in another inflection point in the history of capitalism and Christianity and humanitarianism. You may wonder why we are focusing on critiquing the good capitalists right now as the current US administration is gutting social safety nets, destroying USAID, outlawing DEI, and leveraging domestic terrorism charge against protesters. Is this really the priority? I will not pretend to have anything brilliant to say here, and the cognitive dissonance, I admit, can be overwhelming. But dissonance, conflict, is one way of knowing, the one way that we know that there's a contradiction that could pop out and make something new, and that might be in the process of being managed and assimilated. And this is the question of my book again. What forms, what rituals, what feeling structures, and what palliatives intervene to manage crises when they are at their most intractable and bring us back to the norm? Capitalist humanitarianism is one of these forms. It recruits us into a promise that capitalism provides mutual benefit, a promise that rarely, if ever, delivers. It vests politics in an extremely narrowed terrain of conspicuous transaction, now presented as a gesture of positive solidarity, often at the expense of other kinds of political organizing and imagination. Simultaneously, as states divest from public welfare, capitalist humanitarianism outsources that work to private foundations that are, by definition, by their very charters, unaccountable to public oversight or process. Do some philanthropists and NGOs do good work? Of course. It still isn't democracy. All of this, the contraction of our political worlds, the privatization of welfare, the quantification of life, reproduces the structural conditions through which fascist leaders can capitalize on grievance. The threat and arrival of fascism, especially how those of us located with various liberal institutions, churches, universities, schools, adjust to it, is weighing on me now. I'm sure it's weighing on many of you. The good news is that we can see and name these contradictions and not gloss over them. The bad news is that awareness of them alone is not a politics. And this awareness can be easily short-circuited into an anti-politics. The good news is that the incorporative project, as it marches on, as more is lost, is still incomplete. The good news is that despair and commitment and negativity and sadness and steadfast will to transform the brutal order of things can coexist, and they can even be inseparable. The question I keep asking myself as I contemplate losses, macro, micro, big, intimate, collective, irreducible, is this: what could we afford to lose if we have already lost the most precious things? What worlds could we afford to build together instead? Thank you. Oh, how long? Okay, the question was, how long did it take me to write my book? So the great thing about getting a PhD, there are some really bad things about getting a PhD, but there are a lot of really good ones too. And it's time. It's time to write. And so I wrote this first as a dissertation, and then I spent, this is like way too fast, but I spent a couple of years revising it. So I graduated with my PhD in 2020, and then it came out in 2023. I was really lucky. There was an editor from Duke, Sandra Korn, who read my chapters of my dissertation as I was finishing them. She read them often before I got feedback from my advisors. And I love my advisors. I love Sandra Korn. And that meant that I was writing my dissertation kind of as a book as it was coming out. And then I had really supportive editors and really amazing peer reviewers who told the press I could do whatever I wanted. And that's where the personal stuff started to get woven in as I tried to hone a voice that wasn't just documenting stuff, but also trying to do something at the level of form to maybe be more affecting to the reader and sort of to think about a more specific narrator.
Really amazing presentation. I am reminded of a piece by a fellow Yale from the 90s, Mark Wiener's short chapter called Consumer Culture and Participatory Democracy, which is in some ways a critique of the Coca-Cola model of, buy a Coke, support democracy, love how equal and tolerant we are of a society, because all of us can hold Cokes and be different colors around each other. And I wonder, that you highlight in your book the kind of extractive and exploitative elements of humanitarian capitalism. Could you speak a little bit more about how that feeling of doing good operates in what becomes the American political landscape? Why is it so important? Why do we care about feeling good when it is so easy to do things without even the concern that you need to feel good?
Oh, that's such a beautiful question. Thank you. Okay, so the first thing I want to say is that my entry into the critique of kind of capitalist humanitarianism was as a little firebrand organizer at Agnes Scott College. And if you've ever been to Atlanta, you know that the entire city is funded by the Coca-Cola Company. And they have all of this multicultural advertising, and they're also assassinating union leaders all over the world. And sort of just the awareness of the hypocrisy of that was very much kind of on my mind. They're also, they are funded, their origins are in kind of Methodist missionary stuff. We're in a Methodist church right now. So Coke spreads around the world because one of the brother of the Coke founder, Asa Candler, is following his missionary brother around the world and setting up Coke places in the Philippines and in US occupied zones. And so this is Christianity, capitalism, our empire, deeply enmeshed with each other. So that. The doing good, so I think that the desire to do good is in this tight reciprocal relationship with the kind of masochistic draw to feeling bad and feeling complicit. So when I talked about this kind of litany of I'm aware of how historically complicit I am. I know that many of us have been to church services, have been to places where it's just kind of sort of litanies of confession. And then after a litany of confession, there's an assurance of grace, assurance of pardon. Grew up as a preacher's kid, you just heard me talk about that. And the thing about it though is you don't get assured once, you go back to church the next week and you have to hear it again and again and again. And that's the thing, scholars who think about sort of masochism as a kind of psychic structure, the thing is that the cathartic moment of I feel really bad and now I'm okay. That's not something that happens just once. It's a repetitive cycle. And one thing I was interested in my book, and this makes for a quite demanding read, and some people really don't like this, and I don't know if I really blame them, is that I think it's okay to feel bad and not go to this moment of resolution. So one is what are you doing? How do you, so what would it mean to be yeah, okay, things are really bad. There is blood in my coffee. And stop before saying, okay, so I'm gonna go buy this other really good coffee and feel really good about myself. That doesn't mean don't buy fair trade coffee. I don't want you to come away and be we're not gonna deal with equal exchange anymore in our church coffee hours. It must not mean anything. But I think we can think of it as harm reduction with an emphasis on still the harm of empire. So yeah, I think it's entangled in this cycle, and I think it is partly about sort of a need, perhaps learned through kind of the sort of rhetorical and affective itineraries of Christian mission, to be identified with often a racialized, gendered, poor other, and to get out of the challenge of really having to contemplate, like, there are not easy solutions. And often those solutions don't involve like further investment, they might involve divestment or restraint or boycott or refusal or sacrifice. Thank you.
One of the strategies of resistance that's being, promoted is no-buy days. Days when, we just boycott the whole corporate system. And I'm wondering what your analysis is of that.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, okay, so I think a couple of things. It depends, okay, who's organizing it? Do people just like go buy more stuff the next, like how do we reorganize? So how are we orienting towards that would be the question. So it probably depends on the specific context. So that's my first, I'm being an annoying scholar and giving you a bunch of caveats. I think it's cool to build the muscle of boycott. Like when you're lifting heavy weights, you lift small weights first. So I remember growing up, my mom was like, it's the Sabbath, we're not shopping on Sundays. Now, we still were having all kinds of toys in our house, like we bought a lot of stuff. This wasn't like this wasn't a kind of like generalized asceticism, but it was a set apart time to say like, we're not buying things. And beginning to imagine like maybe consumerism isn't as important. So like as a kind of a practice, you think about like sort of like contemplative or ascetic practices. I think that's like it's a really interesting exercise. I don't think it's enough. Let me say it positively. I think that it can be an invitation to do more. I think a lot of times, I think that like thinking about not just a sort of restraint from purchasing, but what does it mean? What would it mean to restrain from withhold labor? What would it mean to withhold other kinds of consent? But like any opportunities to begin to exercise those muscles and then imagine next, where could they go? Not being satisfied with just one day, but then letting that be an opening, I think that would be my first gloss on that. Thank you.
Do you see a difference between capitalist humanitarianism and humanitarian capitalism?
Oh. I guess it depends on, I was really angsty about using the word humanitarianism in my book, and then I was just like in too deep. But then I'm like, okay, so some people will be like, that's a contradiction, right? The point of putting these words together is to show the contradiction. Like, this is not a humane thing. This is a system that is based on privatization, property, and the extraction of like life from people. And so, and the earth, and life in general. It doesn't have to be just humans. I don't know what humanitarian capitalism would be. I have to think about that. And maybe another way of phrasing your question, I don't know, is like, why not humanitarian capitalism instead of, like, why is capitalism capitalist the adjective and humanitarian the noun? I think it is about the recoding. I think saying humanitarian capitalism modifies capitalism in a way that suggests there are other kinds of capitalism, and they're like humanitarian kinds and other, like, I recently heard a presentation where somebody was giving a talk on racial capitalism. She was a business professor, and she was like, we have racial capitalism, which is bad, but then there's other kinds of capitalism which are neutral. And so kind of participating in that kind of like distinguishing rather than sort of having a more total critique of the structure and the logic and the ideology. I'm just thinking out loud with you. This is a really good question. I think also saying capitalist humanitarianism puts emphasis on a material and ideological project to recode capitalism as itself a humanitarian project. That you think about the terms like job creators, like corporations don't have to be taxed, they can just create jobs, and that in itself is humanitarian. And so kind of thinking about, yeah, but anyway, those are my rambly thoughts about it. Do you have thoughts about this?
I'm sorry.
Do you have a hypothesis?
Well, number one, I have a difficulty relating humanitarianism to a religion of any kind. To me, it's kind of like going beyond religion and thinking humanism, really, almost.
Yeah.
And so the whole issue is a little bit cloudy in my mind. That's all.
Yeah, there are lots of different articulations of humanitarianism, and some would come through a history of like Christian mission, but some would say, no, like this is not what we're about. There's a different kind of, the humanism. I think there's a chapter in my book that talks about humans of capitalist humanitarianism, which is a reference to Humans of New York, and the sort of like imagination of who is a good human subject that deserves care and who is something other than that, who can be cast out. And so there are multiple valences of it.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. You wove a lot of different threads together, and I'm interested in following many of them. The one that I want to ask about tonight is, in the middle of your talk, you said that one of the things you wanted to do was really ask about what it is we're doing when we're doing critique. And I can really tell them that I've borrowed Ben and George's book just long enough to read the intro, so I need to get back from them so I can read more. But so I'm curious if you could just talk more with us a bit about how you're thinking about critique now, and I'll tell you a little bit about where I'm coming from, which is trained as a critical theorist, anti-capitalist. Is this just another supplement in the capitalist residence machine kind of thing? But then also being really compelled by the feminist science studies critique, that critique at some point becomes corrosive. And that there's a limit to what the critique can do. We need to be figuring out something else to do. It seems like you're working with both of those, but I'd just love to hear you talk some more about it.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. So, and also for picking up on that piece. A couple of things. It's a long conversation. One is that I had noticed, I started to be interested in the ways that I thought that certain kinds of scholarship on capitalism and religion were replicating a pattern that I was seeing in the literature of the capitalist humanitarian projects that I was studying, like in their archives and in my interviews and things with the various like investors, CEOs, et cetera, which is the like, here's all the complicity we have, here's the history that brings us to that point. And then often there would be this like kind of quick dismount in the epilogue or conclusion of like, imagine otherwise, or like, maybe it could be different. And I was like, first of all, like that is a pressure value. Like you just put us in a place to like think really seriously about the whole like histories of empire, slavery, colonialism, misogyny, like, and now you're just gonna like it's like a pressure valve release. You're just gonna be like, oh, okay, like here, and I'm like, and so I was mad that there wasn't a substance, right? I was like, I'm pissed about this, which has a little bit of the valence with the kind of like, okay, what is critique for? What does critique do? At the same time, I think you're gesturing to a sort of like body of scholarship. Rita Felsky, Bruno Latour, like those kinds of folks. One of the things that, as someone who was raised by a Presbyterian, I know I'm in Methodist space right now, but I was raised by a real Calvinist, leftist Calvinist mom, and I really am into the negativity of critique. What I want to say is that, what I want to caution against without like being in the like weeds of these scholars right now, although I would love to get into them later, is that sometimes I think that whether in academic spaces or non-academic spaces, and of course that's a blurry line, there is a conflation of affect, tone, emotion, or even projected, like I hear your tone as negative, or I feel nasty reading your book because it makes me sad. You kind of go from this kind of affective emotional zone to like, so therefore you're probably just a nihilist and you're not involved in union organizing at all, and you probably just like hate like any kind of movement. And so one of the reasons I say at the end is that I think negativity and despair and steadfast will to transform the world and commitment can not just coexist, but actually require each other. And part of the reason that I asked the question of what could we afford to lose if we've already lost so much or already lost the worst thing, is that sometimes politics is not about, politics is about a lot of things. Organizing is a lot about small p politics. But it is partly about what are we willing to give up in order to make something else. And that is a position of a kind of like minor note or negativity or maybe even apophatic relationship to revolutionary change, but sacrifice. And so my book is like, the blazing alarm that it has is like, I refuse to tell you what to do instead, and like, I am super negative. And woven through the book are images of radical protest and dissonance and the introduction is like, how do we cueing people? So like there is a hunger strike, also sacrifice, self-abnegation, et cetera. There's a hunger strike and union protests and civil disobedience that are marking time in the book. The interludes are dates, May 2017, and at the center of it is this labor action against the biggest corporation in New Haven, and a billionaire corporation. There are leftist Christians protesting nuclear weapons plants. There are workers being like, sorry, I'm not messing with you, microfinance institutions, I'm walking away. And I'm not gonna sign your consent form to be the like poster girl on your website. There are moments of intimate care between people, and I think that like, what I would say about the sort of like tone of critique is that all of those spaces can manifest and be there as these flashes, but I'm not interested in putting a sign on them and saying, this is resistance, because I have seen so many times, and this goes back to George's question and Julia Eliachar, how the pointing to resistance becomes a kind of commodified slogan, and that felt deeply, that felt troubling, disturbing, unethical, like I can make my list of adjectives, to do as a scholar who was writing about this, flying on planes and traveling around with venture capitalists in Guatemala, like to then start like waving the flag about here's the revolution, like critique had to be the posture. But then in the narrative form itself, there had to be ways to weave in something like contradiction, break, because I also didn't want to accede the hegemony of these people. So I think part of I'm giving you a long answer to this question because obviously it's very important to me in this book. Part of the maneuver around this, has critique run out of steam, is theory dead, like all that stuff is actually less about announcements of where resistance is and what the tone of something is, and more about kind of deftness and thoughtfulness and lightness with narrative itself, and I think scholars need to become better writers. Thank you.
Let me ask you about two other kinds of capitalist humanitarianism. This is not what your book is about, but just one is, some years ago I wrote an article about Dave Ramsey, so I'll call this conservative capitalist humanitarianism. And just your thoughts about that. And then the second one, just before I walked into the building today, I was listening to an interview with Bill Gates. He was talking about he was going to spend out the rest of his money in the next 20 years instead of the next 50 years or whatever it was. And like, there's all this needs now, and government is retreating from the field of stuff that needs to be done, and so we're just going to do it and flood the zone with all this money. So I'll call that scientific capitalist humanitarianism. Figure out scientifically what works best. Okay, there's an organization that I give to, Give Well, that does all these empirical studies. Like, it says, okay, we're going to do these things, but we're going to figure out exactly how much money we need, because if you flood the zone with too much money, it tends to be counterproductive. And so, like, how much money can this organization use to buy exactly the right amount of malaria mosquito nets?
This is a little bit like effective altruism.
Yeah, effective altruism.
Yeah.
That's it, exactly. Just your thoughts on those other alternative models.
Yeah. I think one of the things I'm interested in is how there is sometimes we think in like pretty like binary terms, like the Christian right and the Christian left are totally different, and like the Christian right does this and they do all this financial stuff, and the Christian left, and I'm like, we might be more alike than we think we. Yeah, I mean they are different. I mean obviously very different. Like, people are involved in different kinds of activism or taking different kinds of risks, and like, partly just because, like, you know, these are my folks, like, I'm like, okay, but like, let's be less righteous about how good we think we are, and what are the ways that that Dave Ramsey's financial advice, personal responsibility, et cetera, like positive thinking, ends up kind of rhyming with, or even converging in some cases with, the Christian microfinanciers, or formerly Christian, like ex-Christian, ex-evangelical, or just like fully secular people who have absorbed some like Dave Ramsey like logic, who are evaluating Guatemalan indigenous people for credit based on how much of a positive attitude they perform when the man from the bank shows up at a motorcycle at their house in the middle of the day. And if you smile at him, and if you seem like you have hope for the future, and if you can show that your account books are well organized, like, then you deserve. So like, ideas about deservingness, about positive thinking, about prosperity end up making their way into organizations that would totally disavow someone like Dave Ramsey. And so that's a workaround from like being like directly like, this is what I think about Dave Ramsey, but I think I'm interested in, like, is he really that far away? How different is this? So to the next one about like the sort of effective altruism, Bill Gates stuff. I was teaching a really wonderful class at Brown where we talked a lot about effective altruism, which was interesting. I think students are really interested in this right now. And we specifically were talking about billionaires who fund really important humanitarian projects, like Bill Gates, but particularly this person named Leah Hunt Hendricks, who was the subject of New Yorker profile, who's this heiress to the Hunt oil fortune, who has a PhD in social ethics from Princeton University and wrote a book about solidarity. And she has an organization where it's sort of like liberal to left-leaning rich people get together and fund social movement organizations like Black Lives Matter, like different. And in order to participate, you have to pay $20,000 a year as like sort of like pay in. And so it's still like a very class-specific space. You can't be poor. You can't be able to pay less than $20,000 a year to be part of this organization, which is called Solidaire, for solidarity. And my students were like, but she's funding really good things. She's funding Black Lives Matter organizers. She's doing bailout. And I'm like, that's great. I really co-sign all of that. And every billionaire who has an organization that is funding things thinks they are doing the right thing. And I think, again, harm reduction, right? Like, do I want to seize her assets right now? I'm not sure. I think not only if everyone's assets are seized, right? But where I go with this is like, okay, there's one level at me that's like, yeah, I really hope that like malaria gets funded because USAID is functionally gone. And it's not democracy. This is still very, very rich, elite, small groups of people making decisions that, in my mind, if we are going to sort of commit to social democratic projects, would need to be collective. And that would require mass enfranchisement, that would require education, that would require literacy, that would require all kinds of grassroots pedagogical projects. And now you can see why my next projects are about political education. But I think that we have to kind of work in two fronts here. I'm not gonna say, Bill Gates, you shouldn't be funding it. I will say, I think Bill Gates should be pushing very hard to tax the rich and fund social programs, because as long as it's individual people who are making decisions about who is deserving of humanitarian support and care and life, a lot of people are going to be in real trouble. Yeah, that's what I would say. It doesn't really answer your question exactly.
Just a factual question. The microfinance that ends up with 40% APR, how does that happen? I remember reading this some months ago. I was like,
There are really, really, really good books about microfinance. One is by Lamia Karim. It's called Making Women Pay. It's called Making Women Pay is the name of this book. There's another book called Poverty Capital. And it's so how does it happen? There's there are layers to that question, because part of it is how does it happen institutionally? Part of how it happens institutionally is in sort of is in a move starting in really the 1970s and even before, from kind of community development, Peace Corps, direct, and also sort of direct monetary support, transfers of funds, models of humanitarian aid to we, the United States and the World Bank and the UN and the Clintons, want humanitarian aid to be quote unquote sustainable. And what that means is that humanitarian aid needs to be a mechanism for integrating people in the global south into global financial and consumer markets. And that humanitarian aid needs to have some kind of element to it that is profitable. So if microfinance trains people how to enter the financial systems. Before it's called microfinance and social entrepreneurship, they talk about formal and informal economies. And informal economies are cash under the table. And formal economies are ones that are regulated but also surveilled and taxed and all of that, and it's targeting poor people. So there's this kind of neoliberal movement to change the way that humanitarian aid works, and it's a lot of rhetoric about for your own good, teach a man to give a man a fish, teach a man to fish. There's all this kind of rhetoric, and there's Dave Ramsey again. So there's that. But then how does it happen? A lot of what I saw is a somewhat anti-Semitic, I think, appeal to the dangerous loan shark, which goes back to these old anti-Semitic tropes in U.S. and European history of there are these loan sharks that are operating outside of market regulation who are charging 1,000% interest. And so microfinance is very low interest. Also, they don't say 40% on the websites because it's compounded monthly or sometimes even biweekly. And so that you get to the 40% interest by the 5% footnote compounded monthly. And that ends up being quite a lot of interest. And so so when I would ask about this, I would be like, yo, that's a lot of interest on these $100 loans you're giving out. And they're like, well, these are high risk clients, which is exactly how, that's how people with low credit scores, right? These are high risk clients. We have a lot of overhead costs because we need to teach people how to not only keep their account books, but also there's all this health emphasis. We need to make sure that people are taking birth control so they don't have too many children that they can't support. So Muhammad Yunus, Yunus's Grameen, required people to sign a kind of commitment that they would use birth control. so that you can like do all this sort of like histories of sterilization campaigns and eugenics. And so like there are a lot of overhead costs that the 40% is subsidizing. Lots of staff, but usually the way it's justified is by this appeal to like, at least we're not the loan shark, and look at these really mean loan sharks. And there will be like, there's once a group showed me this role play that they had done that was like trying to educate people in Guatemala about the difference between their microfinance organization and loan sharks. And it was like these mean, like scary men coming in and like threatening to beat them up and run them out of town, and they're gonna kill you, but we're not gonna kill you. But they are like seizing people's assets and seizing people's homes. So there was a Yale Business School or Yale Management School professor I talked to who said, yeah, this is just like the subprime gone global. The subprime, if you all remember, was framed by the Federal Reserve as like about financial inclusion. It's about getting Black and brown poor people to be able to own homes. Kianga Yamada Taylor calls this predatory inclusion in the financial system. And microfinance operates by, and so the subprime, high interest rates, predatory, people lost their homes post-2008. Who got bailed out? The banks, not the people whose homes, who were trying to just like make it by. That too was kind of explained. And I think these were probably sincere aspirations for a lot of people, right? Like people aren't like going into microfinance to be like, let's like screw over like poor indigenous women in Guatemala. I mean, some of them might be, but like most of them aren't. But there's this sort of like, we really, this idea that what good is and what like economic salvation would be integration into global financial systems, and the ends justify the means because at least it's not the loan shark.
So I don't really have anything really profound. I'm just kind of curious about these kids in the shoe shop. That was in 2016, if I remember. And so, do you know anything more about the situation?
I don't know anything else about this situation. It was the longest stop of the day. I will say, so one of the things about so this was not the first time somebody had framed a sweatshop to me as a socially responsible enterprise. Also in the book, there's a guy who was in private equity, hedge fund stuff on Wall Street, got laid off, went to Guatemala and was like funding private business, like sort of socially responsible ventures. And one day I was talking to him and he was like, just made an investment in a socially responsible maquilladora. Really excited about this. I said, what makes a maquilla, a sweatshop, socially responsible? 3 things. It has ventilation. That's one on that place. There's a company store where workers can buy things on credit and have it taken out of their paycheck. I don't know if that's socially responsible. They have a youth empowerment program. And then he said, these aren't kids with a future. These are kids on the street sniffing glue. What are the kids in that sweatshop doing? They're sniffing glue inside of the sweatshop. And so I think this is a pretty widespread logic. I imagine there are a lot of people still working there.
So I'm curious about the kids who were actually there when you were there and how things evolved for them.
No idea. I don't know. I don't know. We were there. We drove away. That was the last I saw him.
It is almost 7:30, so it's time to end. Please give Lucia Hulsether